I think you've all probably experienced buyer's remorse at some point, at least once. Or, if you're like me all the damn time, sometimes you see those shitty sequels coming from like a mile away, but then sometimes they just sneak up on you and you're like, fuck!
And this kinda sucks, because in a time before demos and reviews were more widely available, you would toss all of your allowance at a game that was supposed to be great. Then it turns out, hey, it's severely dumbed down and loses a ton of the mechanics that made the original stand out. Perhaps like somewhere over the years, the point of the original game was completely lost. I mean, sometimes streamlining is okay, cause it opens the franchise up to a wider audience, and sometimes it is nice to see the series try a new thing. But this is actually about the top 10 worst ones. God help me. If you follow me, you know that I've got quite the soft spot for the Bomberman franchise. In particular, the adventure-style games on the Nintendo 64 and GameCube. This was practically my entire adolescence, spending time with the White Bomber and blowing shit up. It was great. And with the arrival of 7th generation consoles came infinite possibilities. Were we going to see an open-world Bomberman game with crazy power-ups, tons of collectibles, a more expansive monster system, or even massive multiplayer zones? How about this instead? An old-school Bomberman game on the Xbox 360, but let's take our cute little adventurous bomber boy and turn him into a fucking super soldier! It's, not what I expected. Do I even need to say anything? Just look at it. Just look at it! You have a health bar for some reason I don't understand. It controls and feels like shit, it sucks, and it just upsets me. I mean, maybe one day we'll get that big adventure-style Bomberman game that I crave, but... nah, fuck. I'm sure that a lot of you out there remember Perfect Dark for the N64. You know, Rareware's spiritual successor to the ever-so-popular GoldenEye 007. Yeah, sure, maybe it hasn't aged as, well as some games, but hey, getting friends together and playing intense multiplayer sessions with bots sure was fun. And so was co-op, running around at like 6 frames a second and failing objectives over and over. But you know what? Following the adventures of Joanna Dark sure was a fun one that required a lot of map exploration and persistence to really make your way through it all. The story, while silly, was interesting enough to keep you moving, and frankly, it felt solid for a Nintendo 64 game. It even got an HD port years later on the Xbox 360 and the Xbox One via Rare Replay. So let's talk about Perfect Dark Zero, the prequel, the reboot, the launch title. First thing you'll notice is Jo's redesign. Rather than simply making her younger, how about we change her hair color to this striking red with some bleached highlights? Let's increase the boobage, therefore adding to sex appeal. Frankly, I don't mind the art style here, but the execution in game is just so wonky. Joanna flails her arms about, and it looks like she has trouble holding on to her pistol at times. She looks and acts super ditzy, fragile. Take a step back to Perfect Dark, where Joanna, our super secret agent, seems so calm and collected. Zero just looks janky. But when we start to talk about gameplay, here's where things kinda hit the fan. Sure, you got your simple options of multiplayer, co-op makes a return, and you got an entire single-player campaign to play through. But you better enjoy a frame rate sub 20 and constant motion blur, because holy shit. Things constantly come to a crawl, everything looks too shiny, and I just can't take Joanna seriously. Rareware knew how vague their fucking objective system was, so they had to implement some kind of GPS to point you in the right direction. The guns all feel the same, you can't even hold more than 3 slots worth of weapons, the controls are super stiff and just feel off. Say goodbye to running around Carrington Institute because there's no central hub here. At this point, it just feels like a normal shooter, but with rolling. I feel like Rare tried to make something good out of Perfect Dark Zero. When Microsoft bought them out, they now had the ability to go more thematically mature. But instead, it feels like they copped out, tried to sell it with a little bit of sex, and rushed 360s out of the door. This makes sense when you realize that both Cameo and Perfect Dark Zero were launch titles for the Xbox 360. So basically, Zero's a horrible sequel to Perfect Dark, as it took the franchise and just died. Did you know? Castlevania 64 is the highly anticipated follow-up to Castlevania Symphony of the Night.
Hey kids, Austin is disposed. Let's talk about DMC 2! There's a lot of reasons not to like this game. Like, a lot of reasons. After the first game brought a whole slew of new things to the gaming table, peeps were totes stoked to see what Hideki Kamiya had in store for the second game. Oh, he didn't make this one. It starts off well enough. Dante does flips while some strange disembodied voice gabs on about how great Sparta was, but then then you get to play it. Now there's some good bells and whistles that came with this proverbial bicycle. Dashing has its own dedicated button, Dante's jacket looks pretty snazzy, and Lucina's ass as well. And that's it! That's literally the only good points I had about this game. The greatest burden this game bears is the combat, which is a far cry from the first games. They say that the devil's in the details, but in this case, there surely isn't. The first game's combat blended a wee bit of a fighting game style into its whole shenanigans, making you pause between presses if you wanted to extend your combo. For example, if you hit triangle twice, then pause, and then mash it a bunch of times again, you'll get million stab out the door. Like, wow. While it sounds a tad bit counterintuitive that a game would make you stop for a spell before dishing out more pain, it actually isn't that bad at all. I mean, you're gonna bash them buttons anyway, and it was a great way to keep combat interesting while still having it relegated to just one button. In this game, though, it's all about them directional presses, girl. Which means that you have to stand there. Don't touch the stick! Don't touch it! If you push the stick in any direction when you begin your combo, you've doomed yourself to the generic. So the game doesn't want you to move whenever you start your combo, which means they're taking out all of the, well, motion in fighting, turning it into static, boring. There's also a lot more focus on gunplay, you know, the worst aspect of the first one. They even capped off how fast you can push the shooty button, taking even more pumpkin spice out of that latte, girl. I mean, look, the first upgrade for your guns costs more than your swords. They knew what they did. And where's all the extra moves you can buy? It's gone. But guns also no longer sustain your combo, meaning that when you're standing there fighting some unseen enemy that's flying away, your combo's gonna go to shite. But don't worry, because the bad camera angles you get mean you're probably not gonna actually hit the thing you're trying to hit anyway. Add this to a world where everything is just brown and gross and boring. And you're just left with a game that ain't got none of that pizzazz. None of what made Devil May Cry, Devil May Cry. It's more like Devil's Gonna Cry, because his game was bad. Well, I'm gonna leave after that.
People have actually been asking me to talk about the Super Nintendo version of Sparkster for the longest time, so here you go.
I love Rocket Knight Adventures. I think Sparkster for the Genesis is pretty solid as well. These games approach level design and platforming in a very unique way where everything feels connected, boss fights are half the game, and the mechanics of using your jetpack are both offensive and strategic. They're pretty good, man! Now, when you place the SNES version of Sparkster directly up against Rocket Knight Adventures and the Genesis version of Sparkster, you'll notice something right off the bat. Why is everything so big? Compared to the others, the character Sparkster takes up a significant amount of space on the screen. He's a big-ass sprite. I guess the developers wanted to throw you closer to the action. But in the interest of not wasting any time, therein lies the entire problem. It's so fucking hard to really tell what's going on. And I feel like they increased the speed at which Sparkster moves simultaneously, creating this incredibly janky camera system where it jerks back and forth constantly. You're forced to take all of these leaps or boosts of faith in random directions. It leads to super unfair insta-kills and absolutely tedious platforming. Well, considering this is a sequel, it's bound to have a bit in common with the others. Apparently, this started out as a remake of Rocket Knight, but it clearly shares the same style as its sequel brother. They're completely different games though, with the only thing in common being the edgy opossum and a few similar songs. Speaking of, the SNES sound chip just wasn't made for this. They used a bunch of samples that ended up sounding super weak in comparison. Here, check it out. Still not convinced? Well, I got one last thing. Remember how cool the robot fights were in the other two games? Well, look at this bullshit. Look at this rock'em sock'em robot bullshit that I can't even begin to properly deconstruct. Sure, it's got some interesting tidbits here and there, but by comparison, I don't think it would be unfair of me to say that Sparkster for the SNES is easily the worst in the entire franchise. Allow me to start with the positives of Final Fantasy XIII. The music is good. Lightning is cool. I have exhausted my list of positives. Final Fantasy XIII is a shitty game. Why though? Well, all of this is easily identifiable within the first 2 hours of playing. Let me give you my scenario. I'm like one of 5 people that really enjoyed Final Fantasy XII, and I even dabbled in 11 for a little bit, so I never really had a falling out with the series up to this point. Trailers were revealed from E3 2006. Oh shit, new Final Fantasy, 3 of them! Fabula Nova Crystallis, 3 different games taking place in the same world, sweet! Aw, cool, another female lead, kinda like Terra. Wow, the combat looks super engaging. Fast forward to 2010, and it was time to finally get my grubby mitts on it. Booting it up, we were greeted with this badass cinematic. The fucking trains, man! I love trains! Things start to hit the fan immediately right away, and it's such a good intro. Alright, time for the first encounter. Oh man, this guy looks kinda threatening. Can Lightning and Saz take him down? Oh, this auto attack? I mean, that's strange, but maybe it'll get deeper. After all, we just started. Huh. No experience points. And I'm just kinda moving forward? Well, it is just the intro. More like the first 30 fucking hours of the game! You don't even gain any kind of experience points for the first 3 hours. Like, what's the point in forcing the player to play that long without any kind of growth whatsoever? If they wanted to make a visual novel, they should have just done that. Even when you do unlock the Crystarium for level growth, you're stuck on essentially one path. It's not like 7 with its super in-depth materia system, or even early Final Fantasies where at least, you know, characters feel different. Instead, 13 gives you this paradigm shift system to quickly change presets for classes, but you're still gonna be auto-attacking. That turns gameplay into auto-attack, change your paradigm to something with healing, and then flip it back. Maybe use an item sometimes? Frankly, it's boring. And by the time things start to open up 30 hours later, there's hardly any game left, and most players will have dropped it by that time. I sure as hell did. Now, if the story was just even slightly interesting, it might have been enough to carry on, but instead, they're shoving terminology down your throat, focusing on the 13 days and how each character has been severely affected by the events at hand. And once you get done with the personal character arcs, they all become lifeless drones that just expel one-liners from time to time. What happened to the grand scale of earlier entries where there's so much world to explore and get lost in? I realized they took it out in 10, but having a massive overworld to walk around in was always part of the charm of a Final Fantasy game. Like here, hop in your airship or chocobo and travel the entire world, get lost in these mini-games, try new builds for your characters, be that asshole with a quadra magic, it's all good. But instead, Final Fantasy XIII and its series of sequels opened the gates for the public to be disinterested in Final Fantasy. Just play Lost Odyssey instead. It's the same people, and it's the real Final Fantasy XIII if you ask me.
You forgot one game, Austin.
I still have a few more to go.
You forgot one game, Austin.
I was about to...
Ninja Gaiden's jump into the third dimension was something a little marvelous. Between the stunning boss battles to the fast-paced, high-stakes combat, there was a lot to love. There's always been a flow to the combat, a constant tug and pull between success and failure. And none of this was more true than in Ninja Gaiden 2. It's a pure spectacle of visceral action, and unlike many of its contemporaries, Ninja Gaiden 2 focuses on efficiency rather than style. Sure, a swathe of combos and weapons are at your disposal, but the relentless assault from enemies ensures that you're always moving, and well, always killing. Ninja Gaiden 2, though not quite as polished as its previous iteration, introduced many things that would make a big difference. Dismemberment didn't just introduce a more visceral reaction to your weaponry, but also more deadlier tactics for your enemies to employ. They'd lose mobility, but gain exclusive suicidal grapples that could prove fatal. This is where obliteration techniques came into play. Fallen enemies would also provide you with essence, a force that fed you currency, health, and ki. This could also be traded for ultimate techniques, where the essence was forcefully drawn into an attack, rather than a buff. This became a situation where decisions had to be made. Do you take the health now instead of relying on more to spawn later? Do you do damage and dispatch several enemies, allowing your health to regen post-wave? With the amount of speed within the game, this was all done on the fly, and it was fucking great. The quick decision-making, the wide assortment of combos and weapons, it was a fun and intense experience that is hard to replicate. That's why in Ninja Gaiden 3 they didn't bother and got boring as fuck. Gone was essence, gone was dismemberment, gone was fucking every weapon. Now you have a game that traded nuance for... what? A waxy narrative that tries to moralize the player's brutality through interruptions, monologues, and fucking in-game QTEs. This isn't a great commentary on violence, especially as it throws a fucking giant T-Rex at you. A fucking giant T-Rex!
It's kinda funny.
Look, By butchering the combos, by having enemies be far less focused on having Ryu's ass on a platter, and generally making the experience an easy, accessible mess, the game misses the entire point of the previous installments. It was filling a niche. It had an identity. This, they went back on their word and re-released it. Oh, and by the way, the story fucking sucks.
Farewell, until we meet again.
Hayabusa respond.
Let's talk Legaia 2.
Legend of Legaia for the PS1 is so fucking good. The story is so simple yet effective. The music is super percussion heavy and really sets the tone at times. The graphics outside of smaller map models are surprisingly detailed and expressive. Look at this shit. Oh, I guess the main thing is how good the combat is. Rather than just attack or defend, you input combos to perform stronger attacks. Rather than focus on generic weapons, everything is based in different styles of martial arts. It's a huge and fresh change of pace for an RPG. You continue to grow stronger, and the story, while simple, is very effective and gives the player plenty of reason to move forward. It's all about driving the mist from the world and returning humanity to its former glory by reviving the Genesis trees. So when Legaia 2 suddenly found its way into my life, I found myself super excited, like the same levels of a new Final Fantasy or Suikoden. Given the source material, would I have a new classic on my hands?
Here I go!
Oh. How did they manage to make it look worse than the original? What is this walk cycle? Why is the combat so slow? Why are her eyes so big? Well, much to my obvious disappointment, Legaia 2 Dual Saga kinda is awful. It's not even technically a sequel. There are no Genesis trees, the mist isn't even a thing. There's no mention of Seru or anything like that. Literally the only thing in common with the two games is the combat system, and they even managed to fuck that up. In Legend of Legaia, when you use a basic combo, it just flows. But in Legaia 2, every little action requires a 2 or 3 second pause for your character to scream the name of the attack. It gets super annoying really fast. Goodbye to martial arts, hello swords and spells. Also cool, let's make our initial party setup a warrior type character and a healer who can attack for the first half of the game. You can cast like 3 or 4 healing spells before you're out of mana. Great! So basically, people in this world are afraid of mystics, who are identifiable by birthmarkings. They have the ability to use origins to exemplify their powers. They're all different and have varying elemental properties, so they're basically stands from JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. Speaking of, look at the main villain Avalon. Look familiar, like a discount Dio? I just can't take this game seriously, especially during the cutscenes in combat. Lips are basically flapping around, and everyone sounds like they're just getting interrupted in the middle of takes, or even have them cut off for the sake of saving space on the disc.
Know what I mean? There! All hail, reign of the brave, pride of the Red Knights!
This game hurts to see, as it killed a franchise with an infinite amount of potential. We'll probably never see another Legaia game because of this, and that's easily the worst thing it could have done.
Good lord.
So I'm gonna talk about the Sonic franchise, but I bet you don't know which one I'm gonna pick. Sure, I could go with the easy ones like Sonic 06, Shadow the Hedgehog, or Tails Sky Patrol. But how about I take a step back in time and talk about the very first Sonic game to offend me? Here's our timeline. Babby me gets a Sega Genesis that came with Sonic 2, I loved it. Rented Sonic 1, it was great. Picked up Sonic 3 at Knuckles, blew my fucking mind. So what was next? No, it wasn't Knuckles Chaotic. It was Sonic 3D Blast. Look at this. Just let's look at it. This, my friends, is Sonic 3D Blast for the Sega Genesis. There's also a Sega Saturn version, but just give me a moment. Ah yes, it was finally time for Sonic's first foray into the 3D realm. The potential was endless. Would we have a third-person view endlessly chasing the horizon? How about an isometric collectathon? Does that do anything for you? Yeah, that's literally all 3D Blast is. You can only progress to the next stage, and sometimes even the next part of a stage by collecting flickies. You know, the bird thing Sega made? Yeah, have fun navigating a 3D plane with that Sega Genesis D-pad because it ain't. It's hard to tell if you're hitting enemies or if you're going to make a jump correctly because guess what? Isometric cameras and Sonic do not mix. Instead of our classic and cool minigames to get Chaos Emeralds, we get this ugly mess. Like, ugh. This was my first time having any kind of buyer's remorse. I mean, for the Sega Saturn version, they did do a couple things differently. The horrendously bored-looking Tails and Knuckles will now fly you in full 3D to your minigames, which are more like Sonic 2 2, the graphics are a bit smoother and the music is just a little higher quality. But my favorite thing about that is when you grab the invincibility power up and it takes like 5 seconds for it to kick in. Sega Saturn, everybody.
I know this last section is gonna be super divided, so I'm just gonna say it.
I hate Dragon Age 2 a lot. BioWare spent about 7 years creating Dragon Age Origins, hiding it from the public to craft this super expansive lore and fully flesh out every aspect of the game. You choose one of 3 races, 3 classes, and multiple origin stories to really create the character that you want to be. What you choose will affect the way you are treated for the rest of the entire game by different people. Are you human royalty? Well, people will generally suck up to you. Are you a dwarf commoner? It's gonna be a completely different experience. Are you an elf mage? Well, that sucks. Everyone's gonna fucking hate you, but that's part of the charm. You really get to experience the character that you wanna be. Combat plays out very classically like Baldur's Gate. You had a choice of strategic top-down heavy-hitting combat or a very MMO-like interface that had its presence mainly on the console versions. There were great characters all over the damn place, fantastical lore bound, and tons of meaningful choices to be made. It was the perfect way to start a franchise. But you know, they had to appeal to a mainstream audience. Some people might be turned off by the combat because, well, it kind of looks like this near the beginning. This doesn't look like a fun time, you would say, clutching your copy of Modern Warfare 2 tightly to your chest. BioWare recognized this and was all like, something had to be done.
And that's when you press a button, something awesome has to happen. So Button Awesome connected now in Dragon Age 2.
Oh man, the music, the style. That launch trailer for Dragon Age 2 was pretty fucking slick, but something was off. Where was the gameplay? Where were any descriptors of the game? What? What is this? The disappointment, the horror. Dragon Age 2 is like BioWare was scoping out a high school 24-hour game jam, found the second place entry, and slapped the name Dragon Age on it. Seriously, this game is unfinished, and it fucking shows. Look at all the things disappearing, the ugly textures, the frame rate of combat dropping to abysmal amounts. Or maybe they're just unfinished animations, I honestly can't tell. Yeah, maybe they wanted to give combat a bit of a spicy upgrade, but couldn't they have tried anything besides a horde mode? I mean, in Origins, whenever a group of 3 or 4 enemies approaches you, you know to brace yourself as things won't be super easy. Every encounter suffers from this and then more dropped in from the ceiling syndrome. It's a good thing that BioWare gave you plenty of options for AoE because all you need to do is use one and then they all just melt anyways. This makes combat, the central part of the game, just feel pointless. And since everything is on extended cooldowns, you're stuck holding an auto attack button anyways. They didn't make it more engaging, instead they made it mindless. I never felt tense from an encounter. I don't even think I had a character ever die on me. Like, a Dynasty Warriors game gives you more depth than this. But Dragon Age 2 is about the story and the characters. Oh well, let's talk about that. Remember how in Origins you chose a background and a story of your own? Well, in 2, you'd better enjoy Hawk. I sure as fuck don't. And of all the things they had to rip out of Mass Effect, they took the dialogue wheel. Why the dialogue wheel? This turns every conversation into a am I gonna be nice or mean kind of thing. Or, you know, just be sarcastic the whole time, but neither of them lead to any good character development.
You'll have to work harder than that to offend me.
Considering that I'm playing as Hawk and not myself, there should be some kind of character development, but there's not. And frankly, with the exception of Anders and Varric, I couldn't give a single shit about the other characters. They all feel so weak and one-dimensional in comparison to other games in the series. I feel like it takes away from the experience a bit, turning Dragon Age 2 into this weird Twilight Scooby-Doo-esque dating simulator, and some of the dialogue is borderline soap opera.
I expected a hardened criminal, not a whining coward.
He didn't tell you, did he? The magistrate is my father. He's tried so hard to keep me, and what I've done, hidden away.
In Origins, conversations with your companions feel quite a bit more fleshed out and, well, a little less young adult fiction. Perhaps that's because certain characters like Fenris have no depth and are just edgy, shitty JRPG protags. There's no reason for some of the companions to even be on your side, let alone your friend. It's nonsensical. At least the dungeons are pretty cool and varying, and by that I mean not at all because they're the same layout most of the time. Dragon Age 2 is what happens when you've got a publisher trying to rush out something as fast as possible, and it clearly shows. The sequel to this, Dragon Age Inquisition, actually fixes a lot of the problems, but stepped in a different direction that I'm not especially fond of either. I mean, yeah, having the character customization back is fucking great. I need this kind of stuff in my RPGs. It's nowhere near as expansive as Origins, but it's closer. Other characters have more personality and aren't afraid to tell you no. The combat can be played strategically or action-like, but it makes sense this time because you're able to chain abilities into combos and really make a difference. The biggest problem comes into the fact that Inquisition is like padding the game, and zones are simply too big. 70 hours in, and I still didn't finish the game, which frankly is a bit too much time to spend when I just want to see the next story mission. Dragon Age 2 gives me, the player, no reason to even want to finish it. It just kinda sits there and asks me to come back, but I think I'd rather bash my skull in with a dragon dildo. And that's a shame, because if you ask me, Dragon Age is like untapped potential, the franchise.